Today we will be reading from Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 through 50. While he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And stretching out his hand toward the disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and my sister and my mother." The next passage will be from Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. So if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete by my joy and being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but the humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you only look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ, who, though he was not the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death and death on the cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in the heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
This is the word of the Lord. You may have a seat. Thank you, Sophia. Those were kind of long passages. I won't be rereading the longest passage in my sermon when we get to it, but I just wanted you to hear the whole passage. I'll have it on the screen, of course, but not the whole passage. So in July 2005, Barry Schwartz, who's a secular psychologist and a sociologist, if you will, he delivered a TED Talk titled The Paradox of Choice. I don't know if we have the next slide for it. Paradox of Choice, where he shared his observations of individualism and the effect that it has on society. Now, individualism is just a moral and it's a social philosophy. It's a powerful force that promises something it can't really deliver, meaning that if we just let everyone be whoever they want to be in a community, then we'll have the best time ever and we'll thrive. That's the promise of individualism. Let the person develop their own unique style. Let them do what really matters to them alone. But it's an illogical nightmare if you explore it enough. And it is something that I think we all have experienced, and in our subconscious we feel that something is off about the way that we're moving forward as society. When we say that we're becoming self-sufficient, self-sustained, like when everything is centered on self, self-made, self-contained, whatever it may be the case. And whereas technology advances and the standard of living improves, and we're actually able to get really highly customized way of life, to the minute of the details, and yet we find that we remain deeply unsatisfied, both as a nation here in the West and across the world. No matter how much the progress, we're still finding that something is off with our culture, and we're always striving for the next thing. We honestly as a society think sometimes this silly thing, and you probably also fell into the trap as I have. If I only have this, then I will be happy. Like if I'm finally going to be making this amount of money, I don't need anything else in life. When I'll be living in my dream house, then it will be good. When I'm going to find and marry the one, my life is finally going to be in order, right? Whatever it may be, substitute it. I'll get my degree. I'll drive this car. I'll wear this clothes. If I'll have this, then I'll be happy. And then generation after generation, what we see, if you look back, is that when it comes about, like that progress or the thing that the previous generation longed for, we now have, and yet there's no satisfaction there still. Because at the end of the day, every individual is part of a whole, right? And when we try to super customize it, we're in this delusion to think that we could ever be self-made, that we could be a standalone kind of person. We all stand on the shoulders of giants, right? The phrase goes, meaning those who went before us, those who brought us into this world. They're a big part of who we are as they shape us. Those who shape and affect us for better or for worse, whether we are aware of it or not. But we are always a product of a community. And yet, we still chase, or the society around us, the culture, continually chases this highly customized approach to life that is supposed to bring deeper joy once you really customize things to your own liking. But instead, we find that our culture more than ever is experiencing what? Alarming rates of depression, anxiety, apathy towards life. There's ever-growing fear and uncertainty. The more complex our life becomes, the more anxious we are about it. Anxious and uncertain over the future, among other things. It's all looming over us, even as we feverishly continue to customize and build the project of our true self, of my own special kind of life. And you think we'd arrive at the contentment and be satisfied or feel satisfied, and yet we continue to long for something deeper. It's almost like as we're doing the work on the facade. It's almost like that the reason is because we're trying to build up something that's just a pretending kind of thing or an outside kind of looking thing, while the true heart of who we are is always searching for more and better, and really maybe searching just for a place to belong, for a place or life where you just feel at home. And so in his talk, Barry Schwartz, he touched upon one important factor, which is quite paradoxical as you explore it deeper. And that is that the more individualized our lives become, the more disconnected and dissatisfied we tend to be. That's the idea that he was exploring. The more individualized our lives become, you would think that we would be more satisfied, but we actually become more disconnected, dissatisfied, and so on. And so he explores this claim that many of us, or of the culture around us, live by this unspoken but official dogma. That is, maximize your happiness by maximizing your individual freedom. Maximize your happiness by maximizing your individual freedom. And then he goes on to say that the way to maximize freedom is obviously to maximize choice. He points to his local supermarket as an example, which is a place that offers 175 different kinds of salad dressings, he goes on to say. Or I have a shot here yesterday or the day before, we went with our friends to Mod Pizza, and it's like, or, the other day I think I told you that Starbucks has 80,000 customizable ways of doing your drink, if you count all of them, right? But the idea here is that you can build whatever you want. It used to be like pepperoni, cheese pizza, maybe Hawaiian. Now you could build your very own space rocket pizza that, you're just going to do the ingredients by the gram if you wanted to. And so he goes on to say that and so this mindset, right, whatever we see in the culture, whatever we see about catering to us from consumerism, like from the store perspective, is reflective of who we are becoming on the inside. We want things to be customized to the point that even our own personal identity has become a matter of choice. Like who I am. I can customize, redefine who people see me as. He goes on to say, we don't inherit an identity anymore. We get to invent it. And we get to reinvent ourselves as often as we like. And that means that every day when you wake up in the morning, you have to decide what kind of person you want to be. And a lot of people live with that. Maybe that's you today, right? Like living with this idea of who am I? And the identity is constantly swinging and shifting depending on whatever wind blows in the influence of your life. And to some effect, that could be very paralyzing. It leads us to disconnect with one another because we're not confident in who we are. Our lives are so highly customized. I lost my place just a second. Our lives are so highly customizable that we lose the point of connection, right? Because we become so individualized with our choices of where we work, what we do, where we study, how our home looks, and so on, we lose points of connections with other people, or at least the deepest point of connections. They become masked by our individual preferences, and that's why our small talk is shallow, because it's like, well, where do we even begin to find points of connection? And so we find ourselves alienated from each other because we ever so rarely share things in common. And whatever we're after, however you're customizing and building your life, it often drains us and leaves us longing still for more openness and connection, vulnerability, because we get tired building up this identity and this image by our own selves, but then we find ourselves tired and exhausted. We do want to connect. We do want to spend time with others. We do want to be vulnerable and really just show who we are and how we're living life. But what usually ends up happening is that for the most part, we find ourselves turning to things that imitate some sort of connection, but isn't really. That it isn't actually connecting with others. Think entertainment, right? Think social media that can light up the same centers of your brain as if you're spending time with somebody. You're getting the dopamine rewards. Sometimes you even feel like, it's social media, right? You're spending time socially, but you're by yourself. Think hobbies that don't involve another person. So we push time with others, and by that I mean not just here gathering in the church on Sunday, but time with others, connecting with others. We push it to the next time. We push it to the periphery of our priorities. Like, that's not as important. I've got my other things before I ever get to time with others. Why? Because today we just don't have the energy and desire to be with one another. And so I would suggest today that by doing that, by pushing aside time with other people, especially in our highly individualized society, we are alienating ourselves from something that is so crucial to our growth, development, and thriving as human beings, for humanity. And that is other-centeredness in the community of others. Other-centeredness in the community of others. That means living life together with others. That means sharing the day-to-day with another human being, or maybe week-to-week with another family or community. And that's integral to our mental and spiritual well-being. Now, Schwartz, he ended his talk by pointing to a picture of a fishbowl, and he said, the truth of the matter is that if you shatter the fishbowl so that everything is possible, so now you're not constrained by your culture, society, or whatever you decide to follow as the guidance for your life, what you have is you don't have freedom, you have paralysis. If you shatter this fishbowl so that everything is possible, you actually decrease satisfaction. Everybody needs a fishbowl. The absence of some metaphorical fishbowl is a recipe for misery, and I suspect disaster, he goes on to say. This was a secular psychologist just observing life. Something that we would say today is a freedom in our culture. Be who you are, be your own self, design your own self. If you study it long enough, right, like it leads to deeper and deeper levels of satisfaction. And so the point is, you need a community, right? And you need a fishbowl, if you will. A fishbowl that will actually make you thrive, not just any kind of fishbowl. You were never meant to live life apart from others. You need others, and others need you. You were meant to live in a community. And as the century unfolds, I think we will find ourselves facing this more and more, and you probably feel it too. People searching for a need for deep, authentic connectedness to others in a world of substitutes and fakes. The search for this need to be loved and acceptance and belonging, and the necessary call of the community to give up the radical individualism for the sake of being there for the other. And so for the church, it will be more important than ever to long to be together. As the world becomes super individualized, more disconnected, our interactions are brief and quick because we need to move on to the next thing. We need to press into being together even more than ever before, so that together we would be forming into the image of Christ. That formation happens together, not alone, not by yourself, not so that we could be formed together into the image of Christ rather than forming into the image of our own making. And so in Jesus, both in his teachings and in his life, we find the most compelling way to heal all that is wrong with humanity, all that is wrong with the communities and our communities around us. And on the pages of the gospel, we find that Jesus' mission was what? To proclaim good news. You probably heard that before. Proclaim the gospel. Well, it's the best news ever. It is the best news ever where God in his mercy is inviting us to open our eyes to the reality of creation, to see things as they are, not to keep guessing as if life was a game and something that needs to be customized and changed until you finally feel like you were right at home, but to see what it is that we were created for. And we were invited to this radical claim of the Bible that we actually could confidently know and feel peace when we find ourselves in the middle of God's story, when we find ourselves finally realigned with the way Creator meant for us to be, as we come to experience forgiveness and invitation to this lifelong journey of following Jesus together in a community. And so it's not surprising that I think time after time I found that sociology and psychology, they tend to confirm the claims of Christianity. That practices that shaped Jesus' life, and we went for about 6 of them so far, I believe this is the 6th one, like prayer, fasting, solitude, generosity, scripture, right? That these practices, they generally lead us into deeper and healthier lives. They generally lead us into deeper and healthier lives. And if knowing Jesus as the reigning king over creation is at the center of those practices, then the Bible says that you are promised not much more than just a healthier and better life here. That you are invited into life as it was meant to be. Never ending, expanding into the next history of humanity, in which we will live on in the new earth and a new heaven as joyful and loving community, surrounded by the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? In a communal presence of God. But it all begins for us here. It begins in the church, in the company of another one on the way. And so, the hope and prayer of all of us here in the leadership at Home Church is that we increasingly become a community of love and depth in the culture of individualism and superficiality through the practice of community, making time with community. And so, if individualism, with its superficiality, leaves us dissatisfied and disconnected or shallow, what kind of community should we seek if we want to live a full life? And Jesus gives us a surprising answer in Matthew chapter 12, what Sophia read to us today, where he goes on to say that while he was still speaking to people, behold, his mother and brothers stood outside, and so they're coming to speak to him. And he replied to the man and told them, who is my brother and who is my mother and who are my brothers? And stretching out his hands toward his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of the Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. My mom is here. She's following along with a Russian translation with the notes that I've given to her right before the service. But imagine if she came over and she was like, she's going to miss out on this part. I don't have it in my notes. Sorry, Mom. But if she came up and she said, hey, I really need to talk to you. I don't know, maybe there's an emergency or something. Imagine me turning and saying, you know what? Somebody comes up and tells me, hey, your mom is here and your brother's out there. They want to talk to you. And I just say, who's my brother and my mother? You guys are. I'm spending time with you today. You know, you are my brothers and sisters. Like, that would be kind of weird. It would be a bit ridiculous to say. And it sounds really bizarre when Jesus says it, especially in the world where familiar loyalty was the highest pinnacle of influence over your life. Like, family was everything. We say in a century, this was more than we can even probably grasp or imagine. And so Jesus is challenging it and flipping it on its head. He's challenging what was the most influential and defining units even of our life today still, right? With a goal to point to the one community that should be the first to shape us. Now, you probably should know a bit of a background, but this was in the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and they did come over. Mark would tell us in a different account that they did come over to kind of talk to him because they were concerned about him beginning the ministry, right? And so he is here talking more about priorities, who you're going to be loyal to first and foremost, to the mission, to God, or to those who are considered closest to you as your family. Because even family can become a sort of religion in itself, to the detriment of our spiritual health and emotional well-being. When we place on our family something that it cannot become, unless the family itself is part of a larger commitment to have Jesus at the center. Thriving family will thrive when it's part of a thriving community. And both will have Jesus at the center. We can truly be a family and deep community when the first thing that unites us is our desire to live for the will of the Father. To live as the Creator intended us to live. When we are brothers and sisters with one another, first through Jesus, then we become in our families and even in our individual lives who we were meant to be, as God works in our hearts, shaping us through the community. See, the Bible from the very beginning tells us a story that we were created for a community. That we were created for community and out of a community. Like before we all came into existence, God and three persons in one existed in eternal community. John in his chapter 16 and 17, he would write that the Son glorifies the Father. It's always other-centeredness in the Trinity. The Son glorifies the Father glorifies the Son, and the Holy Spirit glorifies both the Father and the Son. And so it's out of the abundance of love and joy and community that humanity was formed. It was out of abundance, not out of need. And one of the first imperatives is what to the humanity when it was created? What was the first thing? One of the first things that God told them is be fruitful and multiply, meaning continue to become a community. Isn't it interesting? Because that's said before the fall, before they've decided to step over God's order of life, right, and make decisions for themselves. God said, be fruitful and multiply. It'd be interesting to see what the community would be like, right? This flourishing community living just how God intended for it to be. And if you're wondering how it would be like now that I'm thinking about it, it is seen right now as the church lives it out. That's what it was meant to be. Yes, Jesus right now is inviting us back in restoring us to the new humanity that God is recreating us, right, into that which was meant to be back then. Living out of radical love, self-sacrifice towards other-centeredness, and so on. But the first imperative was to be fruitful and multiply, to become a community of love that is able to love others sacrificially and unconditionally, while being connected to the source, the loving Father. Tim Keller writes this: the life of the Trinity is characterized not by self-centeredness, but by mutually, that means from both parties, self-giving love. And when we delight and serve someone else, we enter into a dynamic orbit around him or her, whoever we're serving. We center on the interests and desires of the other, and that creates a dance, particularly if there are three persons, each of whom moves around the other two. But then came the fall. And what? And it broke us from the communion with God. And shortly thereafter, if you remember the story of Cain and Abel, one murders the other, right? In the very beginning, where the community was supposed to be forming, right after the fall, what we see is that multiply turns into murder. Connection turns in a radical disconnection and murder here. And ever since, we are struggling to find what it means to be a community, or a family, or a tribe, or a country, or a nation. And I'd say it's all because we lost touch of who we were meant to be. We were meant to be relational because that's who God is. And it only works when He is at the center, when we're not cut off from the source. And that's why continually we struggle to define a socialism framework that would work, or a communism framework, right? Like we have all these goals of finally being united together. We're constantly going, iteration after iteration, country after country, trying to find a way, how can we live together as a community again? And so we turn to Jesus, right? God's people. He was already in the midst of those who were supposed to proclaim the coming of Jesus himself, through whom the radical reconciliation of all the nations in the world would come about. And in Jesus' world, if we look at his life in the first century, it was actually illegal I found this interesting. It was illegal for a family to live somewhere without a school close by. Right? So for Jewish people, it was illegal for a family to live somewhere without a school close by. And so for 25 boys, for every 25 boys, a teacher would be appointed, which means they would need to live in such a way that they would be always part of another community. And the culture, of course, as you can imagine back then, was much more connected. There were multiple families often living together in the same yard. They were going to the market, working in the fields. You would be going to a synagogue, which is their worship meeting place, to school, to the river, to the temple. And all of these were social activities, which today in our world are largely extinct. I mean, the most we probably do, even if you still shop in the store, is going to the store. Right? Everything else is really a matter of choice. Maybe filling up at the gas station, but how often do you have a conversation at the gas station? Like largely all of the activities that used to unite a town or a community are gone out of our life, and it's really a thing of a modern making. It happened since the Industrial Revolution, where we moved into the cities and our lives became busy and overwhelmed, and production took care of sharing crops or sharing foods or producing goods, and it really disconnected us. And so, but he lived in a time where there was high social activity, where the encounter with one another was just waiting around the corner. And while it needs to be, even in the time of Jesus, balanced with times of solitude, community was something that Jesus was involved in from very early age. You know, when I think of Luke chapter 2, verse 52, where Luke the historian, he writes, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man." You can't really grow in favor with man if you're not around people, right? This was about his early life. So he wasn't just a recluse, you know, living in his own little house. He was around people. You can't really become known or grow in favor with people if your life is far away from the people who are in your community. The people who know you. The people who know your temperament. The people who know you, what ticks you off. Or just in general, what ticks you, what makes you do one thing or another. And so Jesus doesn't just burst out on scene and is now able to be the community or the community teacher and preacher. He already was, from the early age, practicing connecting in conversations in life with others, right? It doesn't just come about for him. And he probably had to work harder than some of us extroverted folks do. Because the scholars conclude that he was probably most definitely an introvert. Meaning for him, it took an extra step to learn to have those conversations with others, right? On his human side. One of his first miracles, which is kind of interesting, it was while celebrating a joyous occasion with a ton of people, where the two people decided to come together in marriage. And so he and his family are not just guests at the party. We're finding them in the back room, having a conversation with the party host. They're involved with helping and serving. That's the story where Jesus turns water into wine. A wedding in Jewish culture was always a week-long celebration. A whole week it was a week-long wedding feast. This wasn't just a day, a weekend, of sharing meals together, connecting with one another. You could see that this was a society of deep community, right? Imagine today celebrating a wedding for a week. I find that we run out of topics to talk about during our regular one-day wedding. You're sitting with the person next to you maybe for a few hours and you're like already don't know what to talk about. Part of it is because you're so disconnected and you probably just see each other during the wedding, but nevertheless, we find Jesus through his life in a community. And that's an essential practice to his life, and it will have to become for us as well. But he's constantly sharing meals with diverse groups of people, right? It could be the poor one day. It could be the crowd another day, feeding multitudes, right? He's in homes of tax collectors, Pharisees, and then he's sharing a meal with friends. He's spending every Sabbath probably surrounded either by his disciples or by family and friends. He's sharing meals with these 12 men that he was mentoring, and a group of women that was following him as well, right? They're camping together, they're grieving and celebrating and feasting, they're praying and fasting and resting, all of that together, right? Practices are meant to be practiced in a community. Our life is meant to be lived in community. And so the key phrase that I keep bringing up is that if Jesus needed these practices in his life, then how much more we need them. If he is a son of God, and that was formative to who he is and who his mission was, how much more do we need it in our own lives to become and to be intentionally shaped into becoming like him? Again, these practices don't make us any holier. They don't make us better than others. They are not meant to boost our self-esteem about our own selves. But they do allow us to put into practice and form a habit in the areas of our lives, so that God's presence and love can flow into our hearts and then through us into the lives of other people, into the lives of others. So yes, it's jarring when Jesus calls for this redefinition of your loyalty from your familial household, from your family, to the creator of the universe. But it's the best thing that really can happen to you, really. It's one of the best things that you could do is to redefine that loyalty, to really align yourself with the creator. You've probably heard this popular phrase by Jim Rohn, and I've shared it I think a few times, that we are the average of the 5 people that we spend the most time with, right? And I say that because family oftentimes falls into the number of people that we do spend most time with. And some of us are still praying for our loved ones to follow Jesus, to find home with God, to have their lives be turned around and begin to live out their created purpose. So you can't always be aligning your loyalty around the family that maybe is still on the way, right? We need a community of believers to become our first forming family. The community of believers to be the family that has the most influence over our lives. Now, what an amazing thing it is when all of you are believers in the family, and all of you first and foremost are for the community, and then you bring it into your family. And like I said, when we thrive when the community that we're part of is thriving, and then it spills into thriving into our families as well, and it goes vice versa, back and forth. But we need a community of believers to become our first forming family, a place where we belong and connect with one another because of Jesus. A community where we realign our hearts together in worship to our God. A community where we build each other up. A community where we are reminding each other of what is God's plan for us, what He has called us to. Where we are encouraging one another. Where we fight for each other not to be distracted by sin. Where we complete each other. Where we are sent out and encouraged to pursue others so they would come and find the same in this community. A community where we are living together. And this will require a radical shift to prioritize this community, the community that you belong to for a season of this season of your life where God has planted you. And sometimes, I know this is going to sound crazy, but sometimes you even need to prioritize being with the community over family time, especially in the cases when your family time is plagued by negative patterns and expressions. Right? There's nothing good in saying I'm spending family time if your life is in disarray and disorder and you haven't been connecting with your Creator in a community of other believers. You don't just need a community to thrive, you need the right kind of community. One that is centered around Jesus, one that is about doing the will of the Father, as Jesus points out. But like I said, the beauty is that this community can bring the depth and love into your life that will transform every other relationship. That is the promise of God's church. That it will transform your other relationships, one with your kids and one with your parents, one with your siblings, and so on. And so what Jesus is saying in Matthew 12 passage here is that if you let this become your highest loyalty of your life, then you become part of this new family whose bond is closer than bloodline or the biological traits that you've inherited from the people from the closest people in your life. That as you do this, as you go through life with this community, your closest relationships will fall into place, and you will see the larger family that God has created you to be a part of as a place where you get formed. And I tell you, I see this practice of community already coming here. There's not a lot of us here, but I already see it coming to life here at Home Church over the past 6 months. I see how it's slowly sprouting and breaking through. You know, when you're planting, there's a lot of things sort of in the air still, and they're trying to settle down as you're starting to lay the foundation. But we're starting to see here more and more that you, our friends, are becoming more like brothers and sisters, right? Because of what Jesus did. And we start to bond over that. A few days ago, I was sitting with Dave, who was announcing today, right? Dave is stepping up to lay some groundwork for our Justice and Mercy ministry here at Home Church Northwest. And all that means is a way for us, what is a way for us to be deeply embedded in the work here in our town for caring of the people of our city, so that we prayerfully and practically can come alongside and just not be a church that's a great church that gathers there. They sing and pray and they worship God so well, but people who are actually concerned and their heart aches for the city, and they are out there and they are present and they're devoting their time, not to just support this community, but community at large. That's our vision, that who we want to become. We want to have a part of our life be devoted to that. So Dave is stepping up to lay the foundation and the groundwork for it. But he asked a great question, which is, where is the Home Church in years to come, right? Like, what's the vision? How would I answer the question? And I share this with you tonight, that the vision of the Home Church, and this is what I mentioned to him as well, is for us to be a community that is more than a gathering. And you might have noticed it also, it's on our poster there when it says welcome home church. And I remember when I was designing that poster, and I was like, I want to put a tagline on there, but we didn't really have one. And so that happened. And it says a church that is more than a gathering. And it's somewhat prophetic in a sense because it is more than a gathering. A church is not just a building or a time that you get together on Sundays. In fact, if you're coming just to experience the Sunday, you're missing out the other half. Now, you're always welcome to just come on Sundays and experience it or from time to time. But if you want to experience the whole thing, it's also the Friday gatherings when we just sit around a table. It's also the communion where we sit around the table and have a dinner and break bread together. It's also about helping others and being there for one another. Community of people who are learning together to do that, to live in a community. And I know it's going to be a learning curve for some of us, but we are learning, we are practicing, we're trying to really hard to put it into practice, that to see each other as the closest people in my life for this season. That these are the people that are the closest people in my life for a season. To see each other as important. We see each other as a people that are called to share and give our time and resources to build each other up and to encourage one another. That we will not settle for a consumer mindset of just taking, constantly taking, give me, right, for me. But we will always look for ways to give, for ways to be there for another, give up some of our own time and things for the sake of others. And again, I think we're moving into that direction where many of you are stepping up to serve and are looking for ways to contribute. And we've seen already the shift happening towards that more and more. So our success will be that we will learn to live in a community, right, that is connected, that sees each other as at the top of our priorities, along there with our own families, right? And meanwhile, continually expanding as we invite others to do the same. And I don't think that happens by, like, unintentional. Because the Western model of a church has been around long enough to see that just because you show up to an amazing church service where all the ministries are running smoothly, you don't get to necessarily be automatically formed into a beautiful follower of Christ. It really will have to happen in a community. We have to do something different. And so going back to what Jesus is calling us to, these radical, sometimes jarring statements of like, hold on, God is supposed to be, or Jesus is inviting me to see myself with this family first before I see myself identified with my own family, is a radical claim. It's a radical ask. But if we are truly to be transformed, that's what needs to happen. We need to prioritize time with each other. So the invitation is to practice this kind of community, prioritizing each other, fighting against the shallowness and superficiality of our modern lives, and building these trust bridges together, right? Because it takes time to develop trust with someone and build those conversations and move past the small talk. Small talk is important, but it's just a step, right, into a deeper relationship. So that we get to know each other, so that we ignore the awkwardness of social expectations like, well, it's awkward now, maybe I should move on. Maybe you should stay for a little bit. Sometimes it's just a minute, and then you find yourself truly going deeper and connecting with another person. So we would forsake all of that for the sake of deep connection. But our community, of course, has to be defined by the radical example of Jesus, who again, is at the center of all that we do. And so Paul is reminding us in the Philippian passage that we wrote today. He wrote it to a community of Philippian Christians, reminding them how to live together through the example of Christ, how to be a community that has Christ at the center. I'm going to read just part of it for you as a reminder. Pay attention the kind of relationships that we are called to live with one another. And I don't think this should just happen on Sunday. And I don't think this should just happen when you're by chance encountering one of your Christian fellow believers. That this ought to define our day-to-day life with each other. He goes on to say, so if there's any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, meaning like from the Trinity, right? From the community that they are in, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being of full accord and of one mind. Do nothing, not a single thing. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. The others here are not just your family. This is the people here at the church. What does it mean to count them more significant? That means that their time is just as valuable, or I see their needs as my own, or I see the needs of my brother and sister in my community as I would see the needs of my blood brother and sister, if that makes sense, right? That's what he's saying. To count another more significant than yourself. Let each of you not only let each of you look not only to his own interest or his family interest, but also to the interests of others. And then he goes on to have this mind among yourself, which is yours in Christ Jesus. And then he goes on talking about how Jesus served radically. Being the Son of God, came and served, washed feet, was there for others. And so the call is to become like Jesus to the other person in your community, to see them as valuable. Jesus had compassion. He served, he listened, he laughed and cried with others and traveled with them and just did the regular mundane things together with others. He washed their feet and he let his feet be washed as well. And so the way that we can become like him is to spend time with him first. As with any other practice, it's meant to lead us to deeper communion with God first and foremost. Now, I heard a story of a mother and her small son. I have a son there? Yes. Son talking. And he says, "Mother, where did you live when Jesus was a boy?" She goes on to say, "Why, I wasn't alive then, son. Jesus lived a long time ago. That's like almost 2,000 years ago." "Oh," he goes on to say, "I thought he lived when you were little. You always seem to be talking about him." Isn't it wonderful when you know someone who is always talking about Jesus? Right? That's the point of the simple illustration, right? It's clear that the things we talk most about are the things that are closest to our hearts. And so how do we become like Jesus? How can you talk about Jesus as if like he lived in your lifetime so that your little kid is even confused that you lived in the same time as Jesus? By spending time with him. By seeing Christianity not just as an ethical teaching or something, for mental assent to just believe in these doctrines, but seeing it that in the middle of it all is the person of Jesus who longs to know you and be known by you. And so invitation is to be like Jesus, to spend time with Jesus, so that his life is shining through us into the one beside me, right? The people who are sitting right now next to you and maybe the people who are not there tonight. It's so that that shining could happen into the lives of parents, children, spouse, sibling, neighbor, friend, whatever. I have this quote by Henry Nouwen here who says, "However, community is first of all a quality of the heart. It grows from the spiritual knowledge that we are not alive for ourselves, but for one another. Community is the fruit of our capacity to make the interests of others more important than our own." And so the question, he says, therefore, is not how can we make community, but rather how can we develop and nurture giving hearts? How can we develop and nurture giving hearts? So that's what I mean by that we have to spend time with Jesus, is that because it's not just about, hey, let's create the coolest community we can in Skagit County, so that people are like, wow, this is a great place to be. The goal is, how can we be so radically transformed and changed by Jesus, so that when we do gather in the community, it's God himself working through us and in us, right? And we are getting built up and shaped into the new humanity through Jesus Christ. And so, to answer Henry Nouwen's question, right, is to say that we need to have Jesus at the center of our lives. You can be part of this community or another one. Maybe you're just visiting. But what sets you apart is not the style of your gatherings or the flow of your services or the flow of your program, if you will, but whether Jesus or following Jesus is the aim of your whole life. Right? That's what would determine that community is really followers of Jesus. Is your life around Jesus? Here at Home Church, it is our number one core value that will make or break the culture here. And it is that we orient our lives around Jesus. If we're going to skip through this part, every other value is just going to be there for the superficial benefits, right? Every other value is going to make ourselves feel better or make our lives look better. But if we don't orient our lives around Jesus, if he doesn't become the king over your life, others are going to be useless for you. That right there is of utmost importance. And so then, how can I encourage you guys to put it into practice on the things that we've touched about today? Because as you might remember, the 9 practices that we are going through right now, and I think we're on 6 out of 9, the goal for them is to become habits that would shape us continually into the people of love. And so if you're thinking series are over and we're done with the practices, the goal is like, no, we want to have these practices in our life, Lord willing, tens of years into the future of home church, or whatever you're going to move on, the goal is that you wouldn't just drop them because they were a home church thing, but that you would carry these practices into your life because you want intentionally to be shaped into a follower of Jesus, into a person of love. And we'll be concluding our series with an exercise how you can craft your own rule of life. And that's a monastic term. You can call it just the schedule of your practices. Meaning, what is your intentional plan for these 9 practices in your life, right? Because if you're not intentional, our well wishes won't take us very far, right? And so we want to have that accountability with one another, not out of legalism, but because we want to know Jesus more. And we want to make sure that our lives are disciplined. And so we're going to develop these habits, maybe beginning with small things, but we want it to be consistent through our life. So what are some ways that you can practice community? These following suggestions, by the way, are taken from Practicing the Way course, which you can find online. But, for example, daily, here are some suggestions they have. Spend time with kids. Just spend time with your kids if you're a parent. Ask deep questions to start conversations. That's one way to practice community. Ask a deeper question. Go beyond the shallowness. Schedule time of emotional connection with a spouse or a close friend or a sibling. When was the last time you had a chance to do that? Emotional connection, to be present. Call a friend to check in. Practice active listening. These are some things we can do daily. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said this. He was a German pastor during the Nazi Germany, but he was in resistance. And he wrote this: the first service one owes to others in a community involves listening to them. Just as our love for God begins with listening to God's word, the beginning of love for others is learning to listen to them. God's love for us is shown by the fact that God not only gives God's word, but also lends us God's ear. So we do God's work for our brothers and sisters when we learn to listen with them, right? So the idea is that maybe sometimes we just need to close our mouths and talk less, right? And just sit there and listen to the story of another person and get to know them. In fact, I found that personally, that's one of you can have maybe it's just my personality, but have you tried asking people where they work and what they do and how many, where they came from and how their life came about and what's their life story and what stage of life they're in right now? There's so many questions that you could ask. And you could just sit there and listen the whole evening and let the person share their life with you. That's something that we can just step into and practice, be in the community. Just everything else put aside, you and the other person. Maybe weekly, here are some practices you can incorporate. Eat a meal with your community. We do that every single Friday here. Join a Friday if you haven't, and join us as we sit in homes and just share meals and connect with one another. It's not always bubbly and socially. Sometimes there are, moments of quietness, if you will, but give that a try. Give intentional blessing for your spouse or another. Attend a Bible study or small group. Attend a Sunday gathering. Discern ways that you've sinned and confess it to a trusted person, and so on. I guess I'm not going to read all of them, but there are different things that you can do. Call, visit, write a note to a loved one. Host a dinner or a game night. Exercise with a friend. Those are some things you could do weekly. Monthly, receive communion with the others. Right? If you're a believer and you're attending here, we have a communion coming up. Did you announce it, Paul, today? This Friday, right? So in our community group, we'll have communion. Host a party or a prayer or a worship night at your home. Or do an activity with your family or community. That could be hiking, beach, serving, whatnot. These are ways to connect with others. They're not out of this world. They don't have to be super spiritual in the definition of how we tend to define spiritual, like this activity has to involve something out of this world and God-centered. It's just connecting with others and being there for others. And it's especially important in our time. And so like I mentioned already, God is at work here in Home Church already. I heard it from a bunch of you, but this past Friday I was speaking with Nicole and Matt. They just had a baby. And they told me they've been to a lot of places. They've been here for 3 years in the valley. They've been to almost every church from what I've heard. And even outside of town, they went outside of the county. But I just wanted to pass it on to you, right, is that they felt that there was something different here, that there was a deeper sense of community. And there's just a few of us here, right? And I've heard it from quite a few others who have joined us later, right, as we plan. There's a deeper sense of community. And I wish I could say that it just happens naturally for us. But no, it happens because there are people for whom this truly became the family. There are people who are sacrificing everything because they see this community as their new family. And they are here Sunday in, Sunday out. They're here on Fridays and sometimes on Thursdays. And when there's a project that needs to be done, they're here. It just touches me because I see that generosity of time, and I'm just going to be there. Even if it's just a few people, I'll be there. They're here when the project needs to be done or someone needs to be visited. We've always got somebody to count on. Some people stepped up to truly be a community. And I think that's the vision. It's right there unfolding, right? It's all because they're positioning themselves before Jesus. For them, this became the family, the one for which they're willing to live for. Doing the will of the Father, faithfully embracing His heart, the heart of welcoming hospitality and what? Other-centeredness. Let me close by this as I invite you to pray here. By sharing the story of Henry Nouwen, I quoted a few of his statements here tonight. He was a renowned professor of Harvard Divinity School, and he spent years of achieving what people might consider the pinnacle of success. He had prestige, influence, flexible teaching schedule to accommodate his travels. And he became a prominent voice in theology as well. Yet despite all of this, he found himself deeply weary. He described his life as, quote-unquote, isolated and lacking a true sense of connection. Experienced what he called a dark place. What most would say that there was a burnout, right? A sign to take a break and maybe focus on self-care. But now, Henry Nouwen recognized that as a call to something different. Community. And so instead of pulling back, maybe going on a long retreat, he leaned in by choosing to serve at L'Arche, a community for people with disabilities. And he actually lived there, living alongside those he served, and he discovered a new kind of life and a deeper rest, not by stepping back, but by giving himself and connecting meaningfully with others. And this commitment to others brought the rest that he needed, offering him a profound, renewed sense of purpose. He spent the rest of his life living in that community, just serving and being present with the other-centered, other-focused. And so, if you're able tonight, would you please stand? For some of us here tonight, that's what we need to do. Maybe you've been stretched and pulled in different directions as you reflect on your own participation in this community. Maybe you need to begin practicing life in community. Not resting, not more solitude. Maybe what's needed for you, if you haven't been finding time for community, is just that. You need to come to community. Maybe you've been tired and overburdened. Maybe you need to start showing up to community and opening up to others and letting others speak into your life and speak life into your situations and pray over you and support you. You know, like I mentioned, you're always welcome to come and experience the Sunday gatherings, but we would do a disservice to you if we haven't continually invited you to connect with communities on Friday and throughout the week with each other. And so this is not out of guilt or burden to put on you, but out of desire to be there for one another. That's what we are called to support and pray for one another, to celebrate and to weep together. This is a call of practicing community. And all that means is just living together, life together, following Jesus with Him at the center. And so that's what I want to pray over us today, is that we would find a way to practice community that would enrich our lives with Jesus at the center. That you maybe would think over your life and say, maybe I have been pushing people aside. Maybe I've been chasing too many things that I think will bring me happiness and joy. And in the midst of it, I disconnected from my friends, from my family, from my loved ones, right? Maybe I don't have time for others anymore. And so for you, maybe it's time to reflect and see how you can create that space to connect.